Imagine yourself as a pedestrian in an area with regular traffic. You approach an intersection with a traffic light. As you near the corner, the red light glows, signaling that the traffic crossing your path has to stop. You're now legally entitled to cross, with the expectation that traffic will be stopped until the light changes. However, a large truck is barreling toward the intersection at high speed, and it doesn't appear to be even slowing down. Still, you know the law. The driver obviously knows she has to stop. She must know these things in order to get a license. It's the law, not a suggestion. It's required. If she doesn't stop, she'll be breaking the law. You shouldn't even have to take her behavior into account, right? You're not her babysitter. It doesn't matter if she sees you or not. She's expected to be watching the signal. Her truck, her responsibility. As a pedestrian, your safety is also her responsibility, according to traffic laws. As a driver, she is expected to be watching out for pedestrians. That's how it works. Therefore, you continue walking right into the path of the oncoming truck. Without hesitation, the driver slams her vehicle into you at full speed, crushing your arm, your hip, and your ribs, breaking every bone in your body and launching you high up into the air. What the hell? That vehicle didn't even stop. The driver didn't obey the law. She didn't give a hoot about the pedestrian safety. She just assaulted you with her vehicle. How dare she violate the sacred tenets of the road? As you flip, fractured ass over bleeding apple cart and slam down onto the pavement several yards away, your last, outraged yet somehow comforting thought echoes. But I had the right of way. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Every publication that has come out with a hit piece on the men's rights movement has accused us of the vague but malicious-sounding crime of rape apology. It sounds horrible, dastardly, downright creepy, and that's how it's intended to sound. It's intended to have an obvious effect. Nobody wants to be accused of complacency or complicity toward violent crimes. The label is one at which the average person would recoil, and in response to which one would presumably avoid certain topics, or at least certain ideas, in order to ward off such a vitriolic accusation. That is why feminists use it, to control the discussion around human sexuality so that people are afraid to examine perspectives other than those provided for them by feminists. One recent example of this in a hit piece was Mel Magazine's response to discussions by prominent men's rights advocates on the topic of sexual violence and prevention. Writer Isabel Cohn set her sights on Karen as her first target for the label. She wrote that Karen has commented that women have a responsibility to prevent their own rapes. Rather than use the label explicitly, she linked her characterization of Karen's comments to Harvey Weinstein's lawyer's commentary on situational self-defense. It's obvious she intended her attempt at making that association as a means of poisoning the well, but was the attorney's take on rape prevention 100% wrong? Like a man, she takes her surroundings and the kind of people she might be associating with into consideration before making decisions regarding her social and professional activities in order to not make herself vulnerable to someone she does not trust. This is an incredibly offensive idea to feminists who, again, feel that women should be uniquely exempt from any such expectations. When discussing Paul Elam, she admitted that her own target had stated that he has made many of his points by using, as a tactic, being extra loud and controversial in order to be heard, and not treated in a condescending, dismissive way for having spoken. A few paragraphs later, she questioned what kind of woman would speak for a movement in which guys like Paul have, quote, written that some women walk through life with the equivalent of a "I'm a stupid, conniving bitch, please rape me" neon sign glowing above their empty little narcissistic heads, end quote. The quote comes from an article in which Paul was protesting feminist narratives that proclaim women uniquely exempt from normal precautions people take in order to protect themselves against the minority of the population who commit violent crimes against their fellow citizens. Paul was pointing out how those narratives make women who accept them more vulnerable to criminal violence. Feminists hate recognition of that, but they love that quote. They use it all the time, out of context of course, in an attempt to imply that Paul wants women to be raped. What does that usage say about them? According to their rape culture narratives, even though we all know violent crime exists, and even though we all know it's most often predatory behavior, and even though we all know that predators look for vulnerability when determining their targets, and we all know that means making oneself less vulnerable reduces the risk of becoming a target, acknowledgement of all of that information has to end at the edge of femininity. Women are supposed to be uniquely exempt from conditions that exist in the world, you see. Anyone who says we're not is a rape apologist, even if refusal to exempt us from those conditions provides us with a tool of self-defense against rape. Was Paul's manner of pointing out the stupidity of risk-taking in the face of a known threat inflammatory and potentially offensive to feminists? Totally. Was he right about the inherent stupidity of such risk-taking? Totally. Would feminists rather thousands of women be victimized and then turn to their ideology for support and sisterhood than see any women successfully control their own safety? Apparently. Priorities, am I right? Later, Cohn linked to an article Alison wrote about recognizing the irrationality of male sexual violence perpetration. In it, Alison pointed out that men's nature is contrary to the behavior, to the degree that engaging in it would require the perpetrator to endure what would be intensely devastating for a normal man. This was a protest against feminist narratives that treat sexual violence as normal male behavior that must be trained out of all men and boys. Feminists discuss sexual violence as if there is no way to tell which men and boys will become perpetrators, as if male sexuality is naturally predatory and violent, and as if all women and girls everywhere are always under threat of sexual assault from all men and boys in their vicinity because their masculinity itself makes them dangerous. Alison's article, How to Stop Rape, addressed this by pointing out where feminism is wrong about male sexuality. Most men are devastated after being rejected by a woman. What makes anyone think that the average man is going to enjoy enduring the most profound rejection one human being can muster for another, which is exactly what the rapist endures in order to rape? Later, she makes her point even more obvious. If you saw someone eating broken glass, would you assume the glass is tasty or conclude there's something seriously wrong with the person chowing down? Cohn clearly didn't know what to make of that article. Why? Because she didn't read and comprehend what Alison wrote. She looked at it through a filter of feminist dogma. In discussing this, Alison pointed out the feminist rape culture narrative suggests that all men rape, or are complicit in a system of rape. It presumes no difference between criminal or psychotic men who rape and men who don't. What's a feminist to do when confronted with a woman's recognition of the conflict between normal, healthy male sexuality and the behavior of a rapist when that filter makes such recognition impossible? Cohn's response was to treat the point as one of sympathy for the experience of the rapist rather than a recognition that the behavior is irrational, abnormal, and indicates that something is profoundly wrong with him. In support of her objections, she linked to the study Self-Blame Among Sexual Assault Victims Prospectively Predicts Revictimization, a perceived socio-legal context model of risk, by Miller, Markman, and Handley. The study examined women's description of their experiences and post-experience attitudes and behaviors. Its conclusions support feminist narratives, but these assertions are flawed. The researchers failed to differentiate between recognition of risk factors like association with criminals and magical thinking around sexual gatekeeping like the supposition that rapists are triggered by a woman's clothing. Their perspective on sexual violence is biased by the presumption that where feminists and the general population disagree on what constitutes sexual violence, the non-feminist viewpoint must be wrong, and any related thinking must also be wrong. In their report, they state, although an exhaustive review of sexual assault law and criticisms thereof is beyond the scope of the present investigation, a verbal consent legal alternative proposed by Remick, 1993, provides a simple metric against which our analysis of the status quo might be compared. Remick stated that because prosecutors must currently prove a victim's affirmative non-consent to establish that a rape has occurred, the law, quote, creates what is in effect a legal presumption of female consent to sexual activity, end quote. Translation? The researchers disapprove of defining rape as the deliberate contravention of the victim's refusal of, or ability to refuse, sexual contact. What alternative would they prefer? According to their report, in contrast, according to Remick's verbal consent standard, no would mean no, yes would mean yes, and the lack of any verbal communication as to consent would be presumed to mean no. Translation? Researchers' preferred standard is one that ignores everything a woman does except for her explicit answers to her partner's request for permission to engage with her, regardless of her overt behavior. What's their motivation for that? The next few lines explain. Without adopting Remick's recommendation, the law in practice may leave victims believing they are to blame for sexual assault unless they overtly resist, an unlikely event given the fear, intimidation, and frequent intoxication experienced by victims during assault. Translation: the researchers prefer to be able to decide for women whether or not they were raped, when they are or are not competent to consent, and how they must really feel about their sexual engagement with their male partners. They go on to say, in the present study, we hypothesize that to the extent sexual assault victims perceive a socio-legal norm whereby non-consensual sex is permitted by law, they will blame themselves for their own assaults. For example, perceiving failure to have accommodated an overt resistance socio-legal expectation, and in turn will be at greater prospective sexual re-victimization risk. Translation: the researchers used feminist narratives about rape in order to delegitimize women's sexual choices and their opinions of their own experiences in order to promote their concept of sexual consent as more valid than the existing standard used to differentiate between voluntary sex acts and a sexual assault. The researchers leaned heavily on the work of Mary P. Koss, whose research and rhetoric are based on the denial of women's consent when their assertion of it is in conflict with feminist interest. Koss has also called it important to not label forced unwanted sexual contact rape when a woman does it to a man, an admission to a stark double standard regarding consent, personal responsibility, and the concept of sexual violence. She wanted to make sure that while her work maximized statistics indicating the prevalence of male-perpetrated rape, she didn't also increase the perception of female-perpetrated rape. There are 6 different instances of Koss's work, most of which contain self-citation of her own earlier work, and all of which are based on that stark double standard, cited in that paper. In other words, the entire study on self-blame and sexual assault revictimization is based on assigning a higher degree of personal agency to the male side of a heterosexual act than to the female side. It relies on the assumption that any woman's participation in such acts is outside of her control, regardless of her behavior, unless she is explicitly verbally asked and explicitly verbally replies that she has consented. Women are presumed reticent, and men are presumed aggressive. All responsibility is his and only his, including a one-way responsibility to cater to her sensibilities. An imposition, in other words, of a gynocentric standard, meaning one that is concerned exclusively with a female, or specifically a feminist, point of view. This is the underlying conflict between men's rights advocates and feminists in discussion about human sexuality and the phenomenon of sexual violence. Feminists approach these topics from a gynocentric perspective. We approach them from an egalitarian or gender-equal perspective. We don't presume women too helpless, inept, and fragile to communicate their intentions through both verbal and nonverbal means, and we don't see sex as a barrier at which those capabilities end. We even have the audacity to point out that women can commit sex crimes against men. For our recognition of women's ability to make their own choices and act in their own interests, as well as equal responsibility for their own actions toward men, feminists label us rape apologists. It's the only way they have left to impose their own narrative, and they refuse to take no for an answer, no matter how damaging that is to either sex. And that's not creepy at all, is it? Tune in to HBR Talk as we discuss feminist media's use of derogatory labels like rape apologist as a tool for gatekeeping the gender issues dialogue. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options for that time or later on badgerfeed.com.